Very glad to be leading tonight's discussion with our featured author, Anuradha Bhagwati. I'm usually pretty good at languages, so I'm glad I got that right, and I hate butchering people's names, so thank you. And it's memoir. So there is, to me, a certain poetry and a certain necessity of memoir writing, because I think that we have, regrettably, particularly in American society, gotten used to speaking in a lot of platitudes. And it's difficult to come back with some kind of tried and true statement when someone is telling you their personal story. There's always nuance. There's always a sense of unknowing that reading someone else's personal experience gives us a crack in the door or an opening of the window to, that I think is critical for our own personal development. And so I'm very thankful that you have been so open and honest in this book about the journey. And so I would love to kind of begin with this idea of, what is your definition of culture?
Well, I know what culture is for me. I mean, it was very much growing up with an Indian immigrant family that had come from India on ships, which is hard to imagine. I mean, they came by boat to the States for education when they were young, and they were starting their lives. And so education was the most important thing for them, and the most important thing that they passed on to me, and that's what mattered most.
Yeah.
And so it was a strength, and ultimately it was also a little bit of a weakness, because that's all I was focused on.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I grew up an only child, no brothers or sisters to share that pressure with, and my parents were very fierce.
Yeah.
They were, tiger mom, tiger dad, and yeah, I was supposed to do whatever they told me to do. So I never had a voice of my own.
Yeah.
So, but also growing up as an Indian American kid, I was not surrounded by other Indian Americans or too many people of color generally. So when I was growing up, most of my classmates were white, and I thought I was white. That's just how kids are.
Right.
When I was very young, I asked my dad if I was Jewish, because why wouldn't I be, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had some Jewish friends, so yeah, it took me a while to really realize I was Indian, I was brown, this is what this means, and of course as the decades evolved, now that's how I see myself fully, so yeah.
There's I think your family and mine is probably more similar than I might have assumed before I started reading the book, because people tend to define culture as maybe style of dress, cuisine, these other kinds of esoteric things, but how it functions in a household with a principle as grounding and necessary as education is a big deal, because there is an expectation of excellence that especially today's young people with helicopter parents instead of necessarily tiger parents, that there is a kind of inclination to clear the way so that the young people have an advantage and don't necessarily have to struggle or work hard in order to achieve. But your parents and mine were very much like, there is no doubt that you will go to college, that this is crucial for your life development. And so growing up, excuse me, you describe in the book this kind of struggle to please parents, but also to kind of be badass on your own.
Yeah, failure was not an option. It would not have been possible. And those times that I came close, where I just was not good enough for them. And the standards were completely skewed. I mean, it wasn't as if I was actually failing, but anything less than perfection was failure for them, as it is for so many immigrant parents I've discovered, across cultures. But yeah, in the meantime, I had a rebellious spirit, and I was very interested in social justice from an early age, whether it was the environment or children's and women's rights. racial justice. I remember the Rodney King riots happened during my high school experience. That was like the first big, protests that I was a part of, that I was interested in supporting. And so, and that wasn't really, it wasn't really my parents' experience, like growing up in India. Although, now that I think about it, although my dad's older brothers were involved they were freedom fighters against the British Empire. So there were some activists in the family. Yeah. But I didn't really know my uncles in that capacity. So, but yeah, I mean, I was so focused on the books. I had to get into, certain schools, and there was no choice in the matter. So I had very little voice. And, on the inside, I felt like I was kind of being crushed, so, and at some point, I kind of, bled out. I mean, on so many issues, and I could go on, but when I was, about 16, fell in love with my best friend. She was a girl. Like, this was not the Indian way, apparently, right? And so, shocking, right? Like, I'd shamed my family, shamed ancestors I didn't know I had. Like, this was the worst possible thing in the world. So my mother, crushed that. She just ended it. That was that. I shut down. Didn't happen again for years. Because, again, failure is not an option. That was a sign that I was on the wrong path. Yeah. And I listened to everything they said, to some extent. Yeah.
So that balance of education and excellence and trying to be, directed to be very single-minded in that pursuit of what success looked like to your parents was a challenge for you in a number of ways. You described that relationship and how that was stopped. You also found a love of basketball. Yeah. And, in these days, when we talk about college applications and portfolios and what makes a well-rounded student, that, the Ivy League institutions, your parents taught at Columbia, you went to Yale, I went to Penn, these things that you're supposed to do in order to be both a good human and to be this top candidate, even that was a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite thing in the world was playing sports, and this too was not very Indian, right? So I remember I was obsessed with college basketball, and I watched the Knicks constantly, and I would every time my dad saw me watching basketball, he would get enraged. It was honestly funny. Like, there are worse things than your daughter watching basketball. Right. But they just didn't get it. So they sat me down my senior year, and and I wanted to play basketball in college. I was pretty good. I didn't have the height or I was never going to be professional, let's put it that way. But I could have played college ball, and I got recruited by a team, and that was very cool. I wanted to do it. They said you will not play anything in college. You will just focus on your studies. Yeah. And that was that. I remember being crushed. Like, my spirit just died that day. But again, no question, right? Like, I was gonna do what they said. So, and they didn't realize, joy. I think in retrospect, they never prioritized joy. Like, joy was a really American concept. Yeah. And by American, I mean non-Indian. Right. So, right. Yeah, and I remember, even my friends when I was young, there was this idea of fun that was not really my thing. That wasn't cultivated in my culture or in my family. Fun was something you did kind of after everything else was done, if you were lucky. But it wasn't a goal, it was not a goal to be joyful. Yeah. Right. I mean, you got married, you had your education. Yeah. I don't know. I'm confused about which comes first, honestly, like in Indian culture, because I feel like girls and women are basically bred to be brides from birth. So that's always a pressure. But so there's marriage, there's education, and there's making babies, which is true in so many cultures. But certainly, there was a very specific variation on that in Indian culture.
And the level of success, I would imagine that the accomplishments of the child pass upward to the parents, because it becomes a statement on the success of their parenting.
Yes, it's about pride. Absolutely. Yeah, it's risky again. It's not really your child's joy, right? It's all about the family reputation. Fame has been really important in my observation of Indian culture. Fame is a big thing. fame of the people, right? And it's not necessarily like the character that matters as much as that you are known for doing something,
Right.
Which did not, like, those went against kind of the American values I learned in school about content of your character, or what you do. You know, not the degrees you have, not where you come from, not your family name, right? So that there's a particular kind of classism that I gleaned from Indian culture. You know, there's classism in every culture.
Yeah.
But it was, again, very Indian.
But do you think there is an added level of awareness mixed in with all of that as you came to understand yourself as a person of color? Because, you know, Black folks complain all the time, particularly in academic environments and certain social environments, about being the representative.
Yeah.
That your success or your achievements kind of shine a spotlight on you for people that haven't had a lot of interaction with people from your ethnic background. And so you get all of these random questions thinking that you can speak for the majority of your own people, however that's defined by the questioner and you. And that is very uncomfortable depending on how you choose to interact with that.
Yeah, oh God, it's very hard to compare experiences. I mean, one thing about being Indian American is there's so many Indians, there's so many South Asians, right? I mean, we joke around about it, but like, you know, 1.4 billion folks in India.
Right.
But Indian Americans don't really have a political, I would say, much political influence in the United States. Yeah, even in pop culture, like they're sort of just gradually making inroads. You know, probably like The Simpsons, Apu is like the best known Indian American character. Although many
and a source of a lot of controversy.
A lot of controversy, right? So I don't know. Maybe some of you disagree. Maybe Mindy Kaling. I don't know, but it's. We're not known here yet. You know, I mean, we're just not. I mean, there are a couple of Indian politicians, none of whom I'm a fan of.
Right.
I would say bringing again some of the negative qualities of the culture to bear, but yeah, I don't know that I feel like I represent anyone in particular, because most people, I find myself invisible still in the American society as an Indian person. That's
important, and I think that's an American kind of tool in some ways as well. Philadelphia has an incredibly diverse ethnic population. So even when we're talking about Asian or South Asian, there is a significant Laotian, Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Korean community here. And so given the opportunity, you know, even in high school, a lot of our students can learn about the differences that you know, there's a difference between race, nationality, and ethnicity, and begin to have a better understanding of how the socio-political gears of our world work. But most people are still in the kind of big box store categories, you know, kind of way of looking at people and looking at ideas, and balancing that with the pressures that come from aggressive parents who really want to see you be successful on the terms that they have defined, I imagine is difficult. So we came to this point in high school with you love of basketball that wasn't nurtured, love of another being that wasn't nurtured, and yet through it all, you got into Yale. So transitioning from being at home under the constant eye and guidance to being on campus and kind of establishing yourself there. What was that transition like?
Yeah, so this is like where my parents I had been groomed to go to one of these schools that Indians, you know, even in India know about. You know, it was like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. Right? And again, these were names. I don't know that anybody actually knew what those labels meant. You know, if the quality of education at these schools was actually better than anywhere else, because I would argue that it's not. But but those names meant so much. It was all about reputation and fame again.
Yeah.
I didn't like it that much, right? So I felt it was, I never felt particularly comfortable. I was very competitive, but, I was used to competition. I didn't feel like competition was an asset necessarily. And so I felt isolated, depressed, wanted to leave. That was my Yale experience. And I pushed through eventually. I got my degree, but that was really like me fulfilling my parents' dream. It was a very, very Asian American experience.
Yeah.
There's so much in the news today about Asian Americans and sort of this concept of excelling, to the detriment of the children. But this is just how it's been done, how it's done. You just don't say no to your elders.
Right.
So.
But at the same time, you knew how to poke the bear. Just in kind of personal decisions, because you describe a relationship that you had while you were at Yale that you knew your parents wouldn't approve of.
Yeah, I dated a townie. I dated a local guy. That just blew their minds. So there was, whether I was consciously rebelling or unconsciously, whatever, I was rebelling. And so, and the more my parents resisted, the more I became fiercely attached to this guy. And so,
yeah, I was gonna say that's very American of you.
Yeah,
I think when we talk about American teenagers, that is a concept and a practice that we find a lot in our families.
Absolutely.
Regardless of ethnic background.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's true. So I stuck that out. I stuck college out. Graduated, and then very shortly thereafter found the military.
So let's talk about that, because I'm sure there are folks in the room who are familiar with you, who know your story a little more intimately. But I chuckle in kind of reading this idea of you maintaining a sense of rebelliousness despite the expectations of your parents, because like I say, I felt a lot of kinship with you. And for me, that was in high school. I was in a business magnet program, and so there was no other school but Wharton, which is why I ended up at Penn. And yet there's always been this artistic side of me that needed to find expression. And so, excuse me, being in arts groups is really what saved me on campus, having that outlet in order to kind of find myself. So on the other side of an Ivy League degree, you were looking for the challenge, and you were inspired by a film.
Yeah, it was so easy for me. I write about Top Gun and I write about G.I. Jane. I was too young, and Top Gun was very masculine. I was not interested in being a pilot, and I was really too young to have that be my narrative. But when G.I. Jane came out, Demi Moore was it. Just the scene where she's buzzing her head and all of that. And the more violent it got, the more I wanted to be a part of it. The more resistance she faced. This is pure Hollywood. It was all just it was just a pure mythology. There wasn't a fact in that movie, as far as but that was all it took. There was in part female representation, right?
Yes.
What is possible in terms of what women can do physically and mentally. That was very appealing to me, and it also was nothing like my upbringing, right? No one like that existed in my family, because women weren't allowed or encouraged to do that kind of thing. And so I thought, Navy SEALs, right? These are the guys I want to be like.
Right, yeah. Couldn't just be, just enlist. No.
So I walked into a Navy recruiting station in Harlem, which is, this is interesting, right? So, this is a story of every city in the nation, but, it's the intersection of Martin Luther King Boulevard and Malcolm X Boulevard, where the recruiting station is, right? And I remember the first draft of the manager was what would James Baldwin have thought of that, right? But it's so symbolic, right?
Yeah.
So walk into the Navy recruiting station, and the recruiter was just very unimpressive, just very not Navy SEAL-like at all.
Right.
Very friendly. I was turned off by how friendly he was. It's just, it's like diabolical, right? I was so attracted to like grit and toughness and even meanness, which again, very paradoxical. Like my father was a very controlling man. He's very sweet, but man, he could be mean and nasty. He said horrible things to me when I was growing up on occasion. And so I write about all of that, but so there's a little bit of like love tied into like belonging tied into self-hatred, that has been a theme throughout my childhood and my adult life.
Yeah.
So I remember asking him, like, can I be a Navy SEAL? Like, what is, which is such a naive question. Like, little did I know, right? And he's like, of course not, right? And I was just dumbfounded. I just said, why not? I wanted to know, and he had no explanation. I don't think he did know. So he told me all the things I could do. Wasn't very impressed. It was sort of like see the world, It was like a vacation that he offered me, right? So I walked away and I thought, I don't want to do this. And then I thought of the Marines and walked into the Marine Corps recruiting station, and that was what I wanted. They were mean, they were slightly abusive to me. Like it was, I was one of the first women clearly that had walked into that station in a while. Yeah, that was for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, you might even say they were a bit dismissive.
Oh, they're very dismissive.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was all an act. I walked in, they ignored me, right?
Yeah.
I sort of had to like make myself known, coughed a lot, guy on the sofa. It was hilarious. Oh, she wants to be a Marine. This type of thing. So there's a lot of having to prove yourself before I was even anywhere close to being recruited, right? And then I ended up being an officer.
Because you had a degree. You had an Ivy League degree.
I had a degree.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was really curious. Again, I was very naive, very new to the whole military system, so I didn't understand entirely why like a college degree gave you access to being an officer. 5 seconds before I would have been an enlisted Marine, but now they discovered I had a college degree, I could be an officer. So that makes no sense to me, right?
Right.
What is a degree? What does a college degree offer officers? Like, what is that? There was such respect given to that. I didn't understand why, and so. And of course, when I joined, I ended up, most of the folks that I learned from were enlisted, right? They didn't have college degrees, at least not when they went into the military. So there's, again, classism that was enforced within the military that I thought was kind of arbitrary.
Yeah.
So
at that stage, in deciding that because there really wasn't a path to Navy SEALs, that the Marines were the next best because they were the first in, and how that would impact your life, was there a long-term vision for what that would ultimately yield? Like maybe the 20 years in retirement plan, what that all looked like?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know going in what I was getting into really, or I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a 5-year plan. I didn't have a 20-year plan. But there were sort of two things happening in parallel. The first was the kind of daily discrimination that I faced as a woman in the Marines. So basic training, as it's known generally in the military, is still segregated in the Marine Corps. It's the only branch which segregates basic training. So recruits are segregated into male and female units in Parris Island on the enlisted side, and officer training is still slightly segregated in Quantico. And I didn't get that either. I didn't understand, because I want, like G.I. Jane, I wanted to be training with the guys all the time, as much as was feasible. And so, and the reasons that came back to me and other women, again, made no sense, right? It was just a bunch of slogan. And so I didn't understand, like, why is the Army integrating basic training but not the Marine Corps? There's no good reason. So there was that, but there's also, like, I love the ethos of the Marine Corps. Marines they're so diehard. I mean, in like a pig-headed way, and it really appealed to me. There really is something grander happening. Marines do so much with so little. Never give up. All of that is true. So there's this kind of emotional sway that took over me throughout, even as I was facing daily discrimination or harassment. So, and it was hard. It was hard to how do you contain both of those things in one body, one heart? I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. But again, the love and the abuse, it's still with me. Yeah.
So let's stay there, because I think that it has been proven through recent politics and throughout history that the whole idea of a volunteer military service is a big deal in this country, because there are so many others that we consider allies or enemies where military service is mandatory. So there is a level of understanding, there is a level of empathy, I think, that the general populace has about what you have to go through in order to succeed and be respected and be a part of the team, of the Corps, that is lost on people that don't come from military families or don't choose to serve themselves. And you were seeking, in this moment, you were really seeking that level of, I don't know if you would characterize it as discipline, but there was a sense of belonging, a sense of accomplishment that the degree wouldn't give you, that you were looking for out of your service, and you came to understand. Perhaps you got a preview of it in the recruiting office, but you came to understand pretty quickly the inequities that existed in in being capable and really seeking to excel.
Yeah, I was trying to push the envelope in terms of what job assignments were open to women. I couldn't be a human intelligence officer at the time because human intelligence officers were assigned basically to combat arms units, which were all male at the time. So women just could not be a variety of things, which again, didn't make sense to me, didn't understand it, whatever, moved on. Close combat martial arts instructor training position opened up to women. I was like, sign me up. If I can do that, fine. I can't be in the infantry, but right. I can do that. And so went through that, was basically hazed because I was a woman. I loved it to death, even as I was, thrashed the entire way through. Had this very kind of psychotic relationship with the colonel who was in charge, who was, again, very, very scary man, and therefore I loved him, right? Got a black belt and instructed a bunch of my own Marines in these close combat skills. Really fun, really physical, loved it. And then volunteered for an assignment at an infantry school, basically the school in the Marine Corps that trains all the sort of junior infantry, right? And that's where things, I had seen harassment up to that point. I was harassed, certainly my Marines were harassed in the units I was in. But I saw the worst of it at the School of Infantry, which was in North Carolina. And at that point, I was a lieutenant and a captain, and so I was a company commander. And I had at that point seen 2 gigantic cases swept under the rug. So the first was a sexual assault allegation, and not just one, but a group of Marines who we were training. We basically got all the female Marines from Parris Island, and we were training them in combat skills. Yeah. And then they would go on to their specialty assignments and out into the real Marine Corps. And so in my unit, we had a staff sergeant who again, was very pig-headed. He didn't like women. There's always something. Like my radar goes off when I meet people like this. And we found out from dozens of Marines who were training, again, like 18, 19-year-old kids, basically, that he had been touching them out in the field. He had been assaulting them. And so when those reports came to us, we brought it up the chain of command. I was lieutenant, my captain brought it up the chain of command, and within a couple of days, that alleged perpetrator was just transferred out of the unit. Like, they made him disappear. Yeah. And so, again, all of these kids who either had been hurt or who knew, a woman who had been hurt, were just kind of left hanging. And I always wondered, like, what happened to all of those young Marines, knowing that nothing happened to this horrible guy. And the second one was in my own unit when I was a company commander. I was assigned a junior officer who ended up harassing the women in my unit. And so it was verbal harassment daily. And he was assigned us straight out of Iraq. He had gotten a major combat valor award, and so he came back to the States with a little bit of an ego, which is unusual. That's not attached to combat duty necessarily. He had an issue working with women, and he made it known day one when he was assigned to work for me.
Right.
He didn't want to work for women, didn't want to work with women. Why are women even in the infantry? Blah, 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 blah. And they weren't assigned to actually infantry assignments, but we were working at the School of Infantry. And so when the harassment got bad enough, again, it was brought up the chain of command, and when I reported it, swept under the rug. So my battalion commander, my senior officer, accused the women who had been harassed of making it up and trying to ruin the lieutenant's career. And so this was really typical. And so that was really the formative moment in my career, because I decided to take the investigation, or take an investigation outside the chain of command. If it doesn't work within the chain of command, use whatever you can outside the chain of command. And that was basically career suicide. Like it wasn't really done. I had never seen it done. It certainly was not encouraged by the people I worked with.
Right.
But it was offered to me by legal officers in the unit and on base. And it was horribly scary. I had to get a restraining order against the lieutenant. I was threatened by my lieutenant colonel. It was, and I ended up shutting down, on the inside, but still having to be really strong on the outside, because I was still supervising live fire ranges, 400 Marines coming through, learning how to throw grenades and shoot machine guns, and you can't fall apart, right? And I had to be twice as strong as the guys. For a woman, a female officer, basically the only one in the entire unit, to be crumbling, like that was not a thing. That was not an option. So I held it all in for my last year, and the investigation blew up. Nothing happened to the guy.
Yeah.
So.
In the midst of that storm, I think a lot of us, other than the folks who have served in the military, especially the women who understand this firsthand, how do you balance the mantras of God and country and serving against all of the actions that are going directly against those principles?
I mean, it's sometimes surprising to folks when I say, when all of that stuff was going down, there were always some really good guys sticking up for the right thing. So in my last unit, even though that lieutenant was running around saying awful things about women, and the senior officers were protecting him, they all closed ranks, my own Marines, sergeants, staff sergeants, they supported me, they supported the women who were being harassed. And they believed that women should be fully integrated. Like there were a couple of female sergeants I had who were basically the targets of this lieutenant's harassment. And the infantry guys, who had at that point only served with fellow infantrymen, all men at that point, some of them for years and years, were pleasantly surprised that these women could do the job, and they thought actually better than some of the infantry guys they worked with. They wanted them to go to, what was then known as squad leaders course. They wanted them to try out for the infantry. It wasn't allowed at the time, but they thought they could do it.
Right.
They hated that lieutenant. They were like, this guy's ruining our company.
Yeah.
And so even to this day, they remember that moment. They remember what it meant to work with women who worked so darn hard and did such a great job and were betrayed.
Yeah.
Betrayed by senior officers in the end. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for men in the military, for men in the Marine Corps. The problem with the Marine Corps is that training is still segregated at the basic training level, right? It's like, these guys never worked with women. They didn't know what women were capable of. They shouldn't be surprised then, right, that women actually were doing the job so well, right? They can learn that on day one. They can just integrate boot camp, right? So it's not inevitable that this stuff has to happen, that harassment has to happen. But the more we segregate men from women, the more sexism thrives. And the Marine Corps has the highest rates of sexual assault in the entire military, right? That's not a surprise for me. That's not random. That's cause and effect right there.
And what I think is really important about what you say is, if we integrate, if we create a space for people to get to know each other on a human level from day one, it sets a tone, it sets multiple opportunities for whatever preconceived notions you come in with to get out of your own way and acknowledge what you're seeing, what you're, the collaboration that you're doing on a daily basis
absolutely.
within training and within the working environment. How much more complicated, or do you feel it was more complicated, given your own sense of sexual identity within the context of everything that you began fighting for and everything that you were experiencing personally in the midst of all of this?
Yeah, it was really interesting. There are a lot of identities that I kind of carry within me, but I don't, when I was a Marine, I felt like I was a woman first. You know, outside of the Marine Corps, 15 years later, I feel like I'm a brown woman first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like my brownness is the thing that, and part of that is the political climate in which we live.
Right.
But you know, if I were gay or straight, you know, I identified as bisexual at the time, but I didn't talk about it. You know, it was still the era of don't ask, don't tell, and I don't know that many people would have been sympathetic that I was working with. You know, I had a few friends, but and then my brownness again. It was a very odd time to serve because it was a couple years after 9/11. You know, I tell people like there's just a lot of ignorance out there. So most guys I served with who saw me, who hadn't really been around the world in a civilian capacity or maybe read about other parts of the world, like they would just see Arab or Muslim or you know, it was just like brown terrorist, right? That was sort of their starting point. So, you know, they would want to know about my name first, you know, sort of friendly question. It's not really a friendly question. I know where they're going with that.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, once 9/11 happened, things got a little sinister. And so I was also sticking up for, one of my narratives, sticking up for kids in the Marines who were Muslim, whether they were black or Arab or Persian or whatever, right? And things have gotten really sinister in the Marines and the military wide for kids who come from Arab or Iranian or Muslim background. Absolutely. And South Asian as well. And again, there's so much ignorance, right? Like everybody who's brown, there's geographic ignorance, there's religious ignorance, but we're all targets, you know?
Yeah. In this moment of understanding that while you had personal support, institutional support was practically non-existent, that it was easier to kind of diffuse it instead of solving it and everything else. How did you begin to develop your definition of activism?
Yeah. I mean, some of it started within the Marines when I was sticking up for my junior Marines, right? And that happened in virtually every unit where I was speaking up on someone's behalf, even though it was risky. It just felt like I couldn't stay quiet, and that's just who I am. You know, freedom of speech is curtailed in the military for national security reasons, right? There are good reasons for that. But when it came to issues of, I mean, I suppose the military would call it personnel issues. I would call it social justice, right?
Right.
That you don't stay quiet when somebody's being bullied. Like that's just a principle I learned when I was a kid, and I couldn't shut up, right? So, and so it carried on into the civilian world when I, you know, went to graduate school, and I remember being really kind of shocked that I was now, you know, 50% of my class or so was female and allowed to express their opinion, right? Like I had been so indoctrinated in as vocal as I was, in staying quiet, submissive, taking orders, and again, swallowing all of that, the things that made me who I was, really. And I was sitting with a couple of friends. We were talking about June Jordan and Audre Lorde, and you know, these incredible women of color writers and activists, and I just remember tearing up, like, oh my God, like, this is what I sacrificed while I was in the military. I couldn't talk like this. I couldn't speak freely, and so it slowly started coming back. You know, I realized how much self-hatred I had in me, how much shame I had accumulated over the years in uniform, how much I had silenced, and so I met other women veterans along the way. Right? I mean, civilian women kind of gave me the strength and reminded me, oh no, that is harassment, that is assault, this is what you went through. So they named it, and then women veterans, as I met them over time, the next few years, validated that I was not alone. Actually, I thought I was alone, 'cause women in the Marines didn't talk to one another much. We stayed away from one another because there was weakness by association. Like, you don't want to be in a clump of women. Then you'd all be a target of misogyny.
Right.
So we stayed away. I didn't confide in that. I had maybe one good female friend my entire 5 years in the Marines. That's not enough female support. Like,
Yeah.
I need female friendship.
Yeah.
There's something very nurturing about it for me. So, and so I banded together with these women veterans, and we formed this organization to tackle all these issues that many of us had either experienced directly or had seen other women experience. So, discrimination, harassment, assault, the big ones.
Yeah.
So, and we took to Capitol Hill and we spoke unapologetically, and over time, actually over a very short period of time, elected officials listened. And some of that involved suing the government several times over, whether it was the Pentagon or the VA. And the media paid attention, and then elected officials paid attention because they wanted to keep their jobs, and all of a sudden national attention was on women in the military. And it wasn't, it's not like we did all the work, right? So like at that point, hundreds of thousands of women had deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, had died, had been wounded. And I feel like the American public was ready to really appreciate the sacrifices women were making.
Yeah.
Right? It was long overdue. And so when we kind of shifted the narrative, people started listening.
And so, I don't believe in coincidences. I think it is divine timing that we're having this conversation on Equal Pay Day. So for everyone in the room who isn't aware, because of the gender pay gap in this nation, today is the day when the average American woman has earned enough money to equal what she would have made in all of 2018 if she was paid equally to men doing similar jobs. And so this idea of fighting for equality, of defining what equality means, and fighting against harassment and other things that do not hold genders in equal stead, is a significant conversation to have today. Because you can make the same money and that will be of huge benefit to your family. But if every day walking into the workplace, whatever that looks like, there is this sense of you're not good enough. I don't want to take orders or any kind of direction from you because you're different from me. Still puts us at a major disadvantage. And with all of the camaraderie that you've built now and working together with women veterans and getting other people on board, I wonder how you feel progress can continue or might be able to accelerate given the current composition of Congress. Because, our most recent election was a big moment for women achieving elected office and women veterans.
Yeah. So, we could talk about the remarkable women who've been elected to office all day long, but I think the thing that I like to focus on is that there's still military leadership holds a lot of influence and sway over elected officials. There are not enough elected officials who push back against military leadership. There's it's at times shameful. And so we have to threaten re-election, right? Re-election prospects for elected officials before they actually pay attention to women in the military or service members in general.
Right.
There are very few people who serve in the military today, and very few people with relatives or even friends in the military.
Yeah.
There's a huge divide. And so, what's the incentive to care about service members except for, propping them up at the State of the Union and these kinds of things? And I'm actually not a cynical person, but this is what I've seen over the years.
Yeah.
And so, like when Martha McSally, who's an incredible icon in the military for women and men, comes out, this was a couple weeks ago, she spoke out about being raped in the Air Force. And
yes.
She was this decorated combat pilot, and but she was a colonel, and imagine how difficult it was for her. It clearly was. She was speaking to the public for the first time about this horrendous experience. But the majority of victims of assault and harassment in the military are junior enlisted, right? So like, what power do they have? They had even less, right? They have even less than she. And so that's who we need to think about, right? And I like to remind people that I think Senator McSally's on the wrong side of the policy debate. So it's one thing to be a survivor and speak out about your experience and comfort other survivors and inspire them to heal, right? That's all positive. But her role now needs to be to get behind the reforms that are necessary, and she's not there yet. Right. And the reforms that I'm talking about are Senator Gillibrand's reforms. So these are the reforms that we encouraged her to take on, which is take these cases outside of the chain of command.
Yeah.
That there's bias in the system, and survivors continue to fear retaliation from their perpetrators and from their commanding officers.
And as history has taught us, rightly so.
Yeah. And so, yes, we need more women in Congress. We need women to be in office, but they also need to challenge the military. And right now, there's this tendency for elected officials to worship the military by default instead of challenging military policy and culture, which needs to happen. There needs to be civilian oversight of the military. I mean, there is, and there needs to be more, right?
With our current administration, I don't see the needle moving much on that at all. But I wonder, has the Me Too movement been helpful at all?
So it's really interesting, like when we were doing the advocacy that was sort of on the nightly news regularly, this was 2011, 12, 13, 14. Tarana Burke had invented Me Too a couple years prior, right? Now, the nightly news was not covering Tarana Burke at that
not
time,
at all.
as far as I know. And so it took a certain kind of white woman celebrity in Hollywood to take on that hashtag Me Too, and then thankfully, like, Tarana Burke is now the cameras are on her, which is fantastic. But I feel like this kind of version 2, Me Too version 2, Hollywood, has bypassed the military altogether. And some of that is a result of, again, civilian deference to the military, right? Like civilian folks just do not realize that the military operates under its own military justice system, under its own rules, customs, courtesies, and elected officials do not step up and challenge any of that enough, right? There are hearings. There are women in this room who've seen far more than I have. How many hearings have there been on sexual assault in the military?
Right.
The first time I was conscious of it, I was a lot younger. It was tailhook, right? But there have been scandals prior to that, right? Every 5 to 10 years, there's something huge. And the hearings come out, and the media reports and the task forces and this and that. We don't need any. All the solutions are out there. They're on the table. But there's not political will to push the military.
Is it a double-edged sword that there is sort of a deference to the military, but we've also shown in civilian society that we haven't placed a priority on penalizing people for sexual violence? We could talk about the Catholic Church scandal. There are so many instances where the civilian justice kind of ranks, and some would argue that the church is yet another, we defer to, kind of preferential piece. But to move people around instead of making them serve time, instead of getting them the obvious mental health or behavioral health counseling that they need to really analyze the effects of what they have done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of serial predators being transferred from unit to unit or from church to church. It is a very analogous system. And so, until you stop that, until you hold people accountable, nothing's going to change. But with the, I don't know the church as well as I know the military.
Right.
I think the similarity, or the thing we have to worry about or be careful about, is when we culturally have these strong, powerful feelings of either respect or worship for institutions, that there's always a human cost, right? That there are individuals who are going to get swept up in our ideology, in our love for the institutions, whether it's the church or the military. And so it's not important that we love the military, that we respect the military. It's important that we respect service members and that we defend service members,
right.
individuals, our nieces and nephews, right? Those are the kids that we need to respect, not the idea of the military. I don't think the institution needs protection. Mm-hmm. It's the individuals who are getting hurt, right? And so there's, why can't that be the narrative, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing we're doing is anti-military. It's pro-troop, right? It's pro-service member.
Yeah.
Right? Those kids are volunteering to serve during a time of war. We forget we're at war sometimes. We're at war, right?
Right.
We have been for years. Right? So they're volunteering to serve in a time of war so that the vast majority of Americans don't have to think about it. So we should think about them more, right? Mm-hmm. Give them more legal protections, more services.
Yeah.
More treatment, yeah.
Yeah. The reforms that are necessary for our everyday psyche in order to make this world a better place. I want to pause my questions here because I want to give everyone in the audience who might have a question for our special guest an opportunity to ask that. So if there's anyone.
Captain, sorry. This is a little tangential to the mission of SWAN, but a lot of the more recent mass shootings have come from people with military backgrounds and also domestic violence backgrounds. And how specifically does violence against spouses correlate with violence against service members? Are there people that are basically just, I don't need to explain further, you do.
Yeah, no, great question, great issue to raise. I mean, so just culturally speaking, I remember when we brought the issues of sexual assault and harassment to elected officials, we also talked about domestic violence. Mm-hmm. But even as hard as it was to talk about sexual assault and harassment, you could not talk about domestic violence. Like, they did not want to hear about domestic violence. I don't know if it was true for previous generations, right? Like, it is, my sense is that it is so commonplace, and it's not, there are experts on the veteran side of this issue, which is to say that when folks get out, there are social workers, psychologists, VA employees who could tell you stories, right, and also recite the numbers on this. So it's not a secret to the veterans world that domestic violence is happening in large numbers, and I feel like it's sort of an obvious narrative. But on the DoD side, there's a real reluctance to say, okay, we're going to send our young men and women to war, and they might come back with, how would they phrase it? It's that violence overseas, violence on the battlefield will lead to violence in the home. Mm-hmm. No one wants to admit that. In fact, in congressional testimony, they will deny that fact, or deny that possibility. Do you want to add to that?
Well, I can't remember now because I'm too old anymore. But
Marcia is Vice President of Vietnam Veterans of America and has been advocating for decades, and she's amazing.
There was a study. I'd have to look at what it was, but they did take a look at marriage inside the military, and I believe they determined that more military men marry non-military women, and more military women marry military men. Mm-hmm. And then that was the things they were studying, those two interactive pieces. Yeah. And looking at, and for sure, the level of domestic violence, especially between those two groups.
There was a hearing, and I actually write about it in my last chapter. I write a few pages about domestic violence, which I feel is the untouched, untapped issue that elected officials just don't want to touch, don't want to name. It has affected so many families and individual servicemen that I know. There are experts on how violence works. Like I can only speak about my own experience, which is that even though I never shot or killed anyone, I came back I came out of the military with so much rage and so many violent tendencies that it took about 10, 15 years to wean myself off of that urge to hurt people or to hurt myself. And so if that's true for me, and I've seen it in other people who have gone through the painful experience of either witnessing others die in combat or killing others in combat, I feel like there's a really important conversation that needs to be had. It doesn't necessarily need to be a public one, but that veterans really need support to be able to explore whatever it is. Whether it's shame, we often refer to this concept of moral injury, but the things that cannot be named are the things that we most need to talk about, right? So I just thank you for raising that issue.
Please.
I think one thing that I look back, when we talk about sexual trauma, sexual violence, it enrages. It brings up an enraged anger again and again and again. When you sit with military women and you sit in a circle and you start talking. And I was during the Vietnam War. And that was really a cusp that turned sort of the way the water rolled for women. Although, violence in the military against women has always been there, but never spoken about. It was, you didn't talk about it because it was humiliation, it was degradation, and it wasn't anything that a woman was openly talking about, even with other women. But when you talk about Vietnam and you come to the point of the anti-war in 1968 and the cultural changes and the anti-war and the peace movement and the women's movement and all of those things that were on the ground and on the streets at the time, it gave women veterans the opportunity to really jump in with both feet. We had a place now where we could voice the issues that we found objectionable. And they were across the board, even to include any kind of health care for veterans that were women. And so there was a group of women veterans at that time that really came together and consolidated that energy. And I always like to say that was when we really took up the sword. And it's a group of women who then joined with those women that came after us to really advance the magnitude of the issue. And we did not hold back our commitment to moving on with this. And while we have made, as you have said, we've gained some ground, there's so much left because the military complex is a machine. And to change it is almost, it's like trying to move a mountain. And I think now, there are some members of Congress who may be willing to step forward other than Senator Gillibrand, who was really, she was so involved and embraced this concept of getting it taken out of the chain of command for these reports of rape and assault. And she just couldn't get anyone else, well, a few. She couldn't get enough members of Congress to buy into this. And it was so apparent that it was so logical and it was so reasonable and it was so right, but they couldn't do it. But I think there's another timing, that this is approaching again, and it's something that the organization that I belong to, Vietnam Veterans of America, is still pushing towards, and we spend a lot of time with other women groups, women veterans organizations, things of that nature, working on that. And someone who I've known for a long time, Linda Schwartz, was Air Force. And so, and she's been a part of that movement too since she was, came out of the military. And it's an energy that women veterans have found, and they know that they've got a voice now. And so I'm hopeful. The day will come when I will be gone, but it hasn't been lost. It's a march now.
I just want to say a couple points. as you know, I worked at the VA in the leadership for a while. And one of the things that I tried to do was advance the whole issue of military sexual trauma. And I found a very interesting problem. There is a law in the books that says that anyone on active duty is eligible to come to the VA without the consent of their commander. Their commander, they don't need a referral. They can come to the VA and they can receive services, counseling, care, and programs. Yeah, and so to me that was like, yes, because so many feel trapped in the military system. And as I was banging my head against the wall, I learned a couple of things. The first thing is that the military does not accept the terminology sexual assault. It's either rape or it's nothing. It has to be actual touching. Over in VA land, we have sexual trauma. And sexual trauma is harassment, it's also assaults. And so when we try to get the people over on the other side of the river to accept our definition, they said there is no medical terminology with sexual trauma. We do not recognize this. So we had to go another year, okay, back. We got the definition straightened out. But the truth of the matter is that you think about what percentage of the military today are women. Almost 20% of all of the Guard, Reserve, and active duty. What if they started talking about this? What if it really was become known? I mean, I was on a panel with Marsha when she said, what if 25% of the people that work for Prudential said that they were being sexually assaulted by their coworkers? Wouldn't we all get upset about that? But they're not. No one's upset about it. And that's because it's just like you didn't know, like maybe we didn't know either, but we were nurses, so that was a little different. But people don't know what they're getting into. And also, let me just say this, probably the thing that upsets me most and drives me most today is the fact that the rates of suicide by women veterans is over 250% higher. 200 than their
population.
the civilian
women
counterpart.
population.
And it is there is a direct correlation, think with me, to the character of their discharge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
so
how many women were discharged with a less than honorable discharge or discharged with a medical diagnosis of personality disorder,
Right.
bipolar, because of
And so the ones who came to serve their country today in the all-volunteer force were expecting a little better, but it hasn't really turned out to be that way. And I am not sure. I just feel that yes, I actually know Martha McSally because all of us Air Force ladies hang together now. When she said that, I kept thinking, and you were a colonel. And you were a colonel. But I agree with you that the point is that we are talking about many things, but there are people dying by their own hand because of their service to this country. And many of them will never really realize, as much as you do, the dynamics of how that happened.
That's right. I was talking to a clinician last month, like my clinician, right? Like I was in a very dark place, and she had, I know a few things. I'm pretty self-aware. I've written about this. I've done a lot of healing modalities over the years. I teach yoga to veterans. There's a whole narrative I write about, but the pain is still there, and I still need to be reminded by people other than myself that the folks in the military whom I was up against, really, and kind of surviving against, were constantly telling me that what I was experiencing was not discriminatory and was not harassment. In other words, they were defining what harassment and discrimination and assault were, which is exactly what you're saying. And I believed it. Still some part of me believes it. And so, when I find, even in groups of women, as you're alluding to, that sometimes we don't even acknowledge what's happened to us.
Right.
And it's not our fault, right? So there's always this pushback. It's who controls the language.
Mm-hmm.
You're literally talking about language on paper, right? So who controls the language? If we're not able to acknowledge the harm that's been done to us, because nobody's admitted it, right? Well, no wonder we carry around these wounds, right? No wonder the hurt stays with us. It's remarkable when I think about that.
And in a stark contrast between military and civilian life, in regular military terms, because we are guided so much by pharmaceutical companies, every day they can name a new syndrome for something that people have, because they're looking to sell a pill in order to help you treat it, not resolve it, just treat it. And yet fighting to have a concept for many of us as simple to understand as sexual trauma is something that wasn't acceptable. So there is, I thank you all so much for fighting the good fight, in these spaces to help civilians like me understand that there's nothing new under the sun. There might be ideal times where we think that victories can be had and we go at it full steam. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the reality is that it's very cyclical. That there's no such thing as a win that cannot modify itself over time based on the current climate, politically, socially, that's happening in our world. And so as we continue to strive for equity, as we continue to strive for justice in these spaces, that it's an ongoing fight. It might look different 5 years from now, but some of the principles that underpin what it is that folks are fighting for remain the same. And that we've got to figure out a way to cross this gulf between the enlisted or retired and civilians.
I would just say my own comment is with the Me Too movement. I was honored by a group last year, and they're the women this, the women that, and I had to remind them that military women are part of women in America.
Yes.
They're not just over there. And I think that's the issue. If we can bridge that, make our cause as important to them as their cause, then it would be a formidable force.